I never thought something like this could happen to me, especially on Christmas Eve. I've always considered myself a careful person. I live alone in a small apartment, one of those quiet complexes where neighbors barely talk to each other. But you still feel safe. It was the perfect spot for someone like me, busy with work and just wanting some peace and quiet after a long day. But over the last few weeks, strange things started happening. Little things, barely noticeable, things I might not have even realized if they hadn't kept repeating. A mug I was sure I left in the sink would show up in the cabinet. My remote, which was always on the couch, once ended up on the kitchen table. And the weirdest thing, sometimes, when I walked in, I caught a faint smell of cigarette smoke. I don't smoke, and as far as I know, no one in the building does. I figured I was just being paranoid, or maybe forgetting things because of stress. I convinced myself it was all in my head. On Christmas Eve, I went to a small get-together at a coworker's place. Nothing fancy, just a few people eating, drinking, and exchanging gifts. I got home around midnight, tired and ready to take a shower and crash. The night was calm, with that mix of silence and the twinkling of Christmas lights on apartment balconies. But as I got closer to my door, I noticed something was off. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack open. My heart started racing. I was positive I had locked it before leaving. I always double-check. It's a habit. I hesitated for a moment. Part of me wanted to call the police, but another part thought maybe it was just a mistake, something silly I overlooked. So I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. The apartment was a mess. My things had been tossed around, drawers pulled open, clothes scattered on the floor. Even my backpack, which I always left hanging on the chair, was now on the couch with the zipper wide open. I froze for a few seconds, trying to process what was going on. It didn't look like a typical robbery. Nothing was broken, and at first glance, none of the valuable stuff, like my laptop sitting on the living room table, seemed to be missing. None of it made sense. The smell of cigarette smoke was stronger this time, almost as if someone had just put one out. A chill ran down my spine. I quietly closed the door behind me, trying not to make any noise. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I moved cautiously through the living room, taking small steps and looking around. Every instinct in me was screaming to leave, but something kept me there, pushing me to figure out what had happened. When I got to my bedroom, I saw the closet doors wide open, with clothes spilled out everywhere. The feeling of violation was overwhelming. Then I heard a sound. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but enough to make me freeze. It was coming from the bathroom, a light scraping noise, like someone trying to move without being heard. My breath caught, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. Someone was still inside. My first instinct was to bolt, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't move. The thought of someone being in there hiding terrified me. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, I saw the battery was almost dead. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to stay calm, and began slowly backing toward the door. My plan was simple: get out quietly and call for help. But with every step I took, the noise from the bathroom grew louder, a rhythmic sound, like someone fumbling with something, trying and failing to be quiet. The distance between me and the door felt endless. When I got close to the door, I heard a loud creak, like someone shifting or maybe pushing something in the bathroom. That was enough to make me act. I swung the door open and bolted into the hallway, leaving it wide open behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. I ran to the end of the hallway, where there was a large window overlooking the parking lot, and stood there, trying to calm down. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door, but then I remembered that most of them had gone away for the holidays. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911 on my phone. Before pressing the call button, I glanced back toward my apartment. That's when I saw something that almost made me drop the phone. A shadow crossed the living room, heading toward the door. Someone was actually in there. Seeing that shadow was like getting punched in the gut. My hands shook so much that I nearly dropped the phone. I called the police immediately, stammering as I tried to explain what was going on. They told me to stay in a safe place and wait for help, but at that moment, safe felt like an impossible concept. As I waited, clutching my phone like it was some kind of shield, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Quick, hurried steps. The sound was coming from the opposite direction of my apartment, heading toward the emergency exit. I forced myself to look, and for a split second, I saw someone turning the corner. A thin figure wearing something dark, maybe a coat. I couldn't make out their face, but one thing was clear. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. A few minutes later, the police arrived. I tried to explain everything to the two officers who showed up, but my mind was so jumbled I could barely form coherent sentences. They walked into the apartment with me, guns drawn, ready for anything. To my surprise, and a mix of relief and even greater fear, there was no one inside. They searched every corner, opened every door, drawer, and closet, but they didn't find a single person. Still, the state of the apartment backed up my story. Everything was tossed around. My backpack was still thrown on the couch, and the strong smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. One of the officers looked at me and asked if I had any enemies or had noticed anyone unusual in the neighborhood recently. I just shook my head, because honestly, I had no idea who it could have been. As the officers asked more questions and wrote everything down, I started noticing little details that made my skin crawl even more. For instance, the bathroom door, which I knew had been slightly open when I ran out, was now completely closed, and one of the kitchen chairs had been moved. It was facing the front door, almost as if someone had been sitting there, waiting for me to come back. It felt like every corner of the apartment carried some trace of the person who had been there. One of the officers suggested I spend the night somewhere else, but all I could think about was who was that person, and why did they come here? More than fear, it was an overwhelming sense of violation, like my safety had been ripped away from me. They eventually left after assuring me they'd patrol the building, and that I should contact them if I noticed anything strange. Once I was alone, the idea of staying in that apartment overnight was unbearable. I grabbed a backpack, threw in some clothes, and decided to spend the night at a friend's place. Before leaving, I made sure to lock everything up again and even propped a chair against the door for extra security. But as I walked down the stairs to the parking lot, I started to feel like I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling was so strong that I found myself glancing over my shoulder a few times. When I got into my car and started the engine, one last thing caught my attention. The light in my apartment, which I was absolutely certain I had turned off, was now on. That night, I crashed on my friend's couch, though calling it sleep would be a stretch. I tossed and turned, replaying everything that had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that shadow crossing my apartment came rushing back. Who was that person? Why were they in my apartment? Nothing was stolen, and that made it even more unsettling. If it had been a burglary, at least there would have been a logical explanation, but this wasn't that. The cigarette smell, the mess, the chair turned toward the door, it all pointed to someone who not only broke in but waited for me to come back. What would have happened if I hadn't run? The next day, I went back to the apartment with my friend, just to grab what I needed. He thought it was odd when, as soon as we opened the door, the smell of cigarette smoke was still there, almost like it had seeped into the walls. We packed the essentials, and he suggested I stay at his place for a few days, until I figured out what to do. It wasn't until we'd left that I remembered something that sent a chill down my spine. In the chaos, I hadn't noticed one detail: the ashtray on the balcony. I don't smoke and had never used it, but the night before, when the police were there, I saw ashes and a cigarette butt inside it. That meant whoever had been there not only broke in, but stayed long enough to smoke calmly, long enough to feel comfortable in my space. After that day, I could never look at that apartment the same way. I spent a week at my friend's place, trying to decide if I should go back. In the end, I returned, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't really have a choice. I changed the locks and even installed an extra deadbolt, but the sense of security never truly came back. And the strangest part? Everything stopped happening. No more cigarette smell, no more misplaced objects. It was as if the invasion that night had been the climax of something that had been building for weeks. But that didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it was worse. I knew that whoever had done this left because they chose to, not because they were stopped. To this day, I can't explain what happened that Christmas Eve. Who was that person? How did they get in? Why didn't they take anything? And most disturbingly, what were they waiting for? I still have nightmares about the shadow I saw crossing my apartment, and the thought that, for those few minutes, I was in the same space as a complete stranger, someone who could have been dangerous, haunts me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still catch a faint whiff of cigarette smoke, like a reminder that someone had been there. And honestly, that's what scares me the most, the fact that I'll never know the truth.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've never been the kind of person to believe in cursed places or scary stories. I always figured they were just made-up tales from people with wild imaginations or those looking for attention. But what happened to me 2 years ago on Christmas Eve? Even now, just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. I was driving home, taking a deserted rural highway. It was around 8 p.m., and the dashboard thermometer read 19 degrees. You couldn't see much beyond the snow-covered road and a few bare trees in the distance. Everything was calm until I heard a weird noise coming from the rear wheel. The steering wheel started pulling to one side, and that's when I realized I had a flat tire. That's when my nightmare began. I got out of the car, shivering in the freezing cold, to check the damage. It wasn't something I could fix on my own, and to make matters worse, my phone had no signal. I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what to do when I noticed a faint light way off in the distance. It looked like it was coming from a house. It was my only option, so I bundled up in my coat and started walking toward the light. The snow made my feet sink with every step, and the icy wind felt like it was cutting through my skin. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes, I finally made it. It was an old wooden house with peeling paint. It looked abandoned, but the lights were on. I thought that was odd, but honestly, the cold was so unbearable that I just wanted to get inside. I climbed the creaky steps to the porch, half expecting them to collapse under my weight, and knocked on the door. After a few seconds, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps from inside. When the door finally opened, an older man appeared. He looked to be in his 60s, wearing a thick wool sweater, and he seemed as out of place as the house itself. His face was tired, not scary, just empty. I explained my situation, told him I needed help, and he just nodded without saying a word. He motioned for me to come inside, and without thinking too much about it, I did. The house was warm, which was a huge relief after being out in the cold, but it had a strange smell, something between mildew and burnt wood. He led me to the living room, which was lit by a single yellowish bulb. There weren't any Christmas decorations, which felt weird for that time of year, but what really caught my attention were the pictures on the walls. They were old black and white photographs of serious-looking people posing in front of the same house. As I got closer to look at them, a chill ran down my spine. One of the photos showed a man who looked almost exactly like me, only he was dressed in old-fashioned clothes. I just stood there, staring at the picture, trying to make sense of it, when the man who had opened the door suddenly appeared next to me. He was so quiet I almost jumped. He pointed to an armchair and said, "Wait here, I'll get you something warm to drink." I sat in the chair, but I couldn't relax. My whole body was tense. Something about the atmosphere in that house felt off. The walls creaked as the wind howled outside, but the silence inside was unsettling, like it was too quiet. The man came back a little while later with a mug of something hot. From the smell, it seemed like tea, but I didn't want to risk drinking it. He was watching me closely, almost like he was studying my every move. I tried to make small talk, asked if he had a phone, or if he could take me to the nearest town. He just shook his head, mumbling something I couldn't make out. The uneasiness was building. As he walked off toward the hallway, I took the chance to look around again, hoping to find some kind of clue about what was going on. That's when I saw something that chilled me more than the freezing cold outside. Near a bookshelf there was another photo, but this time it was in color and clearly more recent. It was me. I mean, it looked exactly like me, wearing the same coat and scarf I had on that night. My hands were trembling as I picked up the frame and turned it over, hoping to find a date or something written on the back. But there was nothing. My heart was racing, and the thought of staying in that house, even one more minute, began to consume me. I stood up quickly and rushed to the door, but when I turned the handle, I realized it was locked. The man appeared at the end of the hallway, his empty stare fixed on me, holding something in his hands that I couldn't quite make out. Trying to stay calm, I asked, doing my best not to sound panicked, "Why is the door locked? Is this some kind of safety thing?" He stood there staring at me for what felt like an eternity, and then finally spoke in a hoarse, almost inaudible voice, "No one leaves until it's done." That made no sense. "Done with what?" I asked. But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back down the hallway. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I glanced at the living room window, but it was boarded up with planks. Something told me this wasn't just about keeping out the cold. At that point, I started fumbling through my pockets, desperate to find anything that could help. My pocket knife was in the car, and my phone, still useless without signal, offered no help. That's when I noticed the hallway where the man had disappeared was now lit with an eerie red glow, growing brighter and brighter. The light seemed to be coming from a door left slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. I don't know why, but I felt an almost irrational urge to look. The silence in the house felt heavier, more suffocating, and the only sounds were my own muffled breathing and the creaking of the floorboards under my feet. I walked slowly down the hallway, and as I got closer to the door, a strong smell hit me. Burnt wood mixed with something metallic, like iron. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I was trapped, and the only way out seemed to be understanding what was going on. I reached the slightly open door and, with my hand shaking, pushed it gently. Inside was a small, almost empty room with a table in the center. On the table were lit candles, some melted down halfway, and an object that looked like an old knife, its handle carved from dark wood. Next to it was a photo. My photo. It was unmistakable. The same one I had just seen in the living room, but now there was something written on the edge. Christmas 2023. My eyes widened, and my throat felt dry as if the air itself was choking me. It felt like the entire house was closing in, suffocating me, and all I could think about was getting out of there. Then I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly and saw the man standing in the doorway, holding a key in one hand and something that looked like a club in the other. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with that same hollow expression, like I was some kind of prey. I didn't think twice. I grabbed the table and shoved it toward him, knocking over the candles and scattering everything onto the floor. He stumbled, and I used the moment to bolt back to the living room. My mind was in full panic mode, but I knew I needed to find another way out. I ran into the kitchen and spotted a window that wasn't as heavily boarded up. Grabbing a chair, I smashed the glass as hard as I could, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Without a second thought, I jumped through the shattered window, feeling shards of glass tear the hem of my coat and scrape against my hands. The icy air hit my face like a wall, but it was a relief to be out of that house. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could toward the road. My body felt like it was running purely on survival instinct. Every step through the heavy snow felt like an eternity. But finally I saw my car, sitting exactly where I had left it. As soon as I reached the door, I fumbled desperately in my pocket for the keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. Once I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. Thankfully, it roared to life on the first try. Slamming my foot on the gas, I sped away as fast as the icy road would allow. Only when I was several miles away, the dim light of the house fading into the distance in my rearview mirror, did the adrenaline start to wear off. But that's when I noticed something that nearly made me lose control of the wheel. On the passenger seat was something I hadn't put there. A photo. The same photograph I had seen in the house, but now it was different. In the bottom corner, in faint, almost faded handwriting, were the words, See you next Christmas. I drove nonstop until I reached the nearest town. Still trembling and confused, I parked in front of a police station. I told the officer on duty everything, but judging by his expression, he thought I was either crazy or drunk. When he insisted on taking me back to the location to check it out, I agreed. I needed to prove to myself that it had really happened. We drove back down the same deserted road, but when we reached the spot where the house should have been, there was nothing. Just snow and trees. No footprints, no broken window, and no sign of the house at all. It was as if it had never existed. No one believes me when I show it to them. They say it must be some kind of prank or a coincidence. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And the most terrifying part is that Christmas is coming again. Every time I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that someone or something is still waiting for me.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've never been the type to scare easily, you know? Always thought of myself as pretty rational, someone who tries to find logical explanations for everything. But what happened to me on Christmas Eve last year still gives me that knot in my stomach every time I think about it. It was the night of December 24th, and I decided to go for my usual nighttime run around the neighborhood, despite the freezing cold. Running helped me clear my head, and I really needed that. Christmas prep was behind schedule, and I still had a mountain of presents to wrap. The streets were almost empty, which wasn't surprising for Christmas Eve. All I could hear were my own footsteps hitting the pavement and the sharp sound of the wind cutting through the air. On my third lap around the block, I noticed a car. It was a black sedan, nothing fancy, parked at the end of the street with the engine running. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, but I got that weird feeling. You know, like someone's watching you. As I ran past, I caught a glimpse of a figure sitting in the driver's seat. I could feel their eyes following me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, and kept running. But every time I looped back around, the car was still there, and that feeling, like someone's eyes were boring into me, only got stronger. It was enough to make me cut my run short and head straight home. When I got back, my heart was still racing, but I blamed it on the run, or maybe my overactive imagination. I locked the door, shook it off, and got back to work. After all, it was probably just someone waiting for someone else, right? I dove into wrapping presents. The living room was a mess of wrapping paper, ribbons, and boxes, but there was something soothing about it, especially with a Christmas movie playing softly in the background. By the time I looked up, it was after midnight. I got up to grab more wrapping paper and, out of habit, glanced out the window. That's when I froze. The same car was now parked directly across the street, right in front of my house. Only this time, the driver wasn't inside. He was standing next to the car, completely still. It was hard to make out details in the dim light from the street lamp, but he was facing my house, looking right at my window. It was like he knew I was there. My first instinct was to turn off the living room lights and back away from the window. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I tried telling myself it was just some weird coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone nearby, but the way he stood there, it was impossible to ignore. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call the police, but I hesitated, worried I'd sound crazy reporting something that might be nothing. I decided to watch for a little longer, hoping he'd just leave. Peeking out from the edge of the curtain, I tried to stay hidden, but he was still there, still motionless. The only thing that changed was the tilt of his head, now slightly to the side like he was trying to get a better look. My stomach dropped. At that point, the uneasiness was unbearable. I picked up my phone again, ready to dial the police, but when I looked back out the window, he was gone. The car was still parked, but he had vanished. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide what to do next. My first thought was to check every door and window in the house to make sure they were locked. Every shadow on the wall felt more menacing, and the silence outside made it worse. When I finally made it back to the living room, I took another cautious look out the window. That's when I nearly lost my balance. He was in my yard, not walking, not moving, just standing there, a few feet from the house, staring straight at me. And then I noticed the detail that chilled me to the bone. He was wearing a red Santa hat. But it wasn't festive. It was filthy, like it had been dragged through the mud. I didn't know what to do. I turned on every light in the house, hoping it would send a message, that I knew he was there and that he'd leave. But no, he just stood there, completely still, with a posture that didn't even seem human. I was trying to stay calm, but the panic was impossible to ignore. I grabbed my phone again and this time dialed the police. As I waited for someone to answer, I cautiously moved closer to the window to see if he was still there, but he was gone. No footsteps, no sound. He had just vanished. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, doing my best to sound rational, though it was hard to hide the fear in my voice. She said they'd send a patrol car to check the neighborhood and told me to stay inside with everything locked. I followed her advice, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like his eyes were still on me, even though he wasn't in sight. I went upstairs to check the view from the bedroom window, just to be sure. That's when my heart nearly stopped. The man was on the sidewalk, directly in front of my house, staring up at the very window I was standing at. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. Being inside, with locked doors, felt meaningless when it seemed like he always knew exactly where I was. He didn't make any sudden moves, didn't knock, didn't yell, he just stood there, staring. There was something unnatural about the way he held himself, almost like he was enjoying my fear. I picked up my phone again to update the police, but before I could start dialing, I heard a noise coming from the back door. It wasn't a loud knock. It was more like something scraping against the wood. My breath caught in my throat. The back door led to a small fenced-in yard, and I was certain I'd locked it. But the sound continued, like someone slowly dragging their nails across the door, taking their time. I forced myself to go downstairs, trembling from head to toe, to check through the peephole. As soon as I got close, the sound stopped. I looked through, but there was nothing there. The silence was suffocating, so thick it felt deafening, and for a brief moment I thought maybe he'd left. But as I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye through the living room window. The Santa hat, lying on the ground in the middle of my yard. I couldn't stop staring at it. It felt deliberate, like it had been left there for me, as some kind of message. But a message for what? The police finally arrived, and I rushed to the front door, fumbling with the locks in my hurry to let them in. I spilled everything, every detail, while one officer checked the yard and the other walked up and down the street. They were polite, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They said it was probably just some drunk prankster or someone playing a joke. Still, they promised to patrol the area for a few hours before leaving. But even as they reassured me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. After the police left, the silence returned, but I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, every light in the house blazing, clutching my phone like a lifeline, ready to call again if needed. When the sun finally started to rise, I felt a small wave of relief. Mustering up some courage, I decided to go into the yard and grab the hat. I wanted to get rid of that awful reminder. But as I got closer, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Stitched on the inside of the hat, with faded red thread, was a single phrase, "You were next." I dropped the hat like it was on fire. My whole body shook, and I couldn't decide whether to run back inside or collapse right there in the yard. Who would leave something like that? Why would anyone do this? I felt exposed, like every move I'd made that night had been watched by that man from the very start. The police were long gone, and I knew calling them again would only make me seem even more paranoid. I grabbed the hat using a shovel, avoiding touching it at all costs, and dumped it straight into the trash. Then I bolted back into the house and locked every door again, but no amount of locks could shake the feeling that this wasn't over. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly peeking out the windows, scanning for the car or the man, expecting him to reappear at any moment. But nothing happened. He was gone as suddenly and mysteriously as he'd appeared, like some nightmare I'd conjured up in my mind. Still, even now, I can't pass that block without my chest tightening and my heart racing. I stopped running at night. I installed cameras all around the house and became obsessed with checking the footage. I've never seen anything strange since, but every Christmas I think about that hat and the chilling feeling that, for some reason, someone might have been waiting for something that night, but for whatever reason, decided to let me go.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.